All right, everybody, this is Brendan. I got some weekly writing advice for you. Except that, again, I sort of don't. Because this is one where advice maybe isn't quite the right word, just because that would end in me sort of saying, hey, you should do this, you should do this. This is more, let me just lay out a situation, all right? And then the lesson that you take from this is going to depend on where you're coming from and depending on what your goals are. Okay. So there's an episode of The Simpsons where there's a joke where Abu, the convenience store owner, is leading the Simpsons up to his secret rooftop garden, and the secret staircase up to the secret rooftop garden is when you open up the freezer, part of the freezer in his store that's full of non-alcoholic beer. And you reach in the freezer, you open it up, and there's no beer in there. There's really just the secret staircase going up. And the joke in that episode of The Simpsons is. I think as Bart says, well, what do you do if somebody wants non-alcoholic beer? And then Abu says, it never comes up. Which is, and I think that there's a lesson there. There's one of those little jokes, but I think there's something we can apply to this. Because let's think about this non-alcoholic beer for a second, how this is put up. All right, so when somebody decides to make non-alcoholic beer, they're thinking, okay, so people really like beer, right? I mean, they like having this cold beverage. They like sort of this flavor, the flavor of the beer. They like the logos on the cans and sort of the mystique sort of surrounding the beer. But the problem with beer clearly is that when people consume the beer, people also sort of get drunk and do terrible things and get into traffic accidents, get into fights and say embarrassing things to their significant others and all this stuff. So what if we could take all the good stuff with beer and get rid of all the bad stuff? And then they produce non-alcoholic beer. And the issue with non-alcoholic beer is that it seriously fails to evaluate. Not actually. People are actually smarter than this. There's other reasons people drink non-alcoholic beer. But the main reason, the motivation behind the Simpsons joke is the idea that maybe whoever it is would think that non-alcoholic beer is a good idea. Somebody that's not quite fully understanding what it is that their audience actually wants. And is just going on sort of their own assumptions where it's sort of okay, well, this is clearly the good part and this is the bad part. And having a little bit too much faith in their own judgment about that and not looking at what the audience is actually demonstrating that they've interested or said that they've liked. So, non-alcoholic beer. Moving on just for a second, I'm going to talk about my series of fantasy novellas. Called The Orphan Fleet here. We got this, we got this, we got this, we got this. You can get all these guys. If you go ahead and click down on my Amazon links, you can find these guys. And the Orphan Fleet stories are a little bit different than most of the stuff that I put out, and definitely the stuff that's more wider spread, which tends to be either the thing that I have the most successful with, which is the short story collections that are at least 50 to 75% horror and all at least kind of leaning that way and have some sort of grotesque things in them, and that are not really alternate world fantasy. One of the few things that those short stories have in common, actually, is that they're not really alternate world fantasy stories. They're set in some version of the world that we're in, maybe occasionally in the near future, because there's a little bit of science fiction, but mostly it's not alternate world, and it's sort of free of elves and dragons and stuff like that, right? So even though the short stories cover a ton of different ground, one of the few things they specifically don't do is what the Orphan Fleet stories do, and then lots of the other novels that are the ones that have had a little bit more success. Still less than the short story collections, but at least there's a little bit of a pathway going from the short story collections down to the White Rabbit Society books, which are sort of urban fantasy kind of, sort of, or the Charlie Harmer books, which are also sort of more horror, but also kind of urban fantasy and also ghost stories and sort of a mix of other things. There's more of a pathway there. There's more sort of well, if you like this, that you'll like this. The Orphan Fleet stories, in comparison, were basically, I always grew up reading fantasy, and I liked fantasy, but the fantasy that I specifically liked was always either sort of the magazine-length stuff, where it's sort of all the Robert E. Howard short stories, where they're all short story to novella length, or those old skinny old paperbacks. And there's actually an article that I wrote in Lovely Blackgate magazine, the Blackgate website, which is a little bit separate from the Blackgate magazine, which also put out lots of fantasy stories kind of along these lines. And I think that the tagline they used was sort of adventure fantasy rather than sword and sorcery, because they wanted to sort of expand the realm of what these things are. Because sword and sorcery is not really considered super trendy right now, and then many of the circles where it is a little bit more trendy tends to be a little bit more conservative, and I don't mean politically conservative like that, but I mean more sort of very specific in what it wants, right? And this is where I got into trouble with the Orphan Fleet stories a little bit, because when I was looking at other kinds of fantasy, not only just sword and sorcery and sort of the shorter fantasy that I like, but also of the, looking at the fantasy bookshelf of a bookstore or a library or whatever else. I have trouble calling it a mistake. And that's where this sways away from advice. But I went down a very non-alcoholic beer form of wine, right? Where I thought, okay, fantasy is cool because it has these, it's got tons of action in it. We got sword fights and stuff. Sword fights are cool. People are flipping off of things, crashing through windows and swinging off chandeliers in the last minute. And there's like monsters and stuff sometimes. All that's really neat. There's these, you get to go to these sort of cool places that you get to sort of imagine these like exotic locations that you sort of get to picture in your mind that are different than anything that maybe you've seen before, that give that little rush of sort of going into a new city or a new place that is exotic and exciting and strange and someplace you can learn about. And what else? Okay, there's there's romance, there's love, there's sex, there's these things. These things are good. I like this stuff, right? And I have like a little list I'm looking at. Let me see what else is the list here. Yeah, so I think that covers it pretty well, right? And all that stuff seems super exciting, I was interested as a reader. I'm interested in that stuff. I wanted more of it. But in lots of the fantasy that I was reading, first off, if you got away from these sort of shorter magazine or novella length or slim, tiny trade paperback length stuff that I really liked, and I went to lots of these giant, books the size of bricks that you can find in a library where it looks like they're meant to hide a rock hammer inside of or something like that so you can escape from prison. And then when you actually read them, it's not a matter of just 1,000 absolutely scintillating nonstop pages, but okay, now it's a little bit of a slog. You get the sense they're sort of paid by the word. They're kind of lulling people to sleep a little bit. And often, there's sort of action, but the action is kind of mixed up with often a weird obsession with militarism, kind of, and it's sort of and some of these books tend to sort of, even the ones, especially the ones that are sort of claiming to be, these are the gritty, hardcore books about what war is actually like when orcs are involved, where you kind of got the impression where it's sort of okay, technically this is supposed to be tacking against the fantasy, except that apparently somebody just has a fantasy of being really miserable and involved in a really long, protracted war where everyone is dying of dysentery and getting their limbs chopped off, and that's what's really exciting to some people. But okay, great. Some other things that tend to happen is that, there's lots of chosen ones all of a sudden. Lots of these things tend to be about being a king or being a queen, where it just sort of seems surely if people stop and think about it, people don't actually want to be royalty. They understand that royalty is stupid, right? And that being part of royalty is terrible. And that even sort of the idea that, royalty would actually be important in terms of having some kind of magical power bestowed on it. Surely that's not what people actually enjoy. People don't want that, right? Clearly that's just sort of a side effect. And again, there's a few things that this where what else there's lots of things that's involved in fantasy, right? Or if you want to get back just to the sword and sorcery fantasy, sort of the idea where it's sort of all these books are really sort of exciting and they're very tactile, and they involve, rather than involving some of that destiny stuff, they sort of involve ordinary people dealing with crazy environments and kind of making the best of it that they can. But it's always got to be a guy in the main character, and there's all this kind of crypto-racist stuff that people can now go on these giant Reddit threads trying to figure out whether or not we can really say that Conan is racist or not. There's a lot of sexual assault in there, and I don't know if could we have the good stuff without that? So the consequence of this was, again, I waived these books because, again, I really do like these very much. We got the Orphan Fleet books. Basically what I was aiming at with those was to take the stuff that I thought that I liked, that I thought that people really liked, and to develop that stuff and then chop off all the stuff that clearly seemed pretty lame to me that nobody else would like, all right? And what I did was I'm going to pull short of calling it a mistake because, again, I ended up with something that I really like, that a lot of people whose opinions who respect, and even the people that are close to me, my girlfriend really likes these books. That's a big deal. Forget the rest of you. Who cares? That's, that to a certain extent, that is kind of enough for me. But in terms of something that I can sort of build on for the future, I made a non-alcoholic beer mistake with these books. And I think it's a really simple thing to make non-alcoholic beer mistakes, like in other genres. Again, if you decide that you're going to write a kind of a noir detective story, but you think it's geez, it's kind of lame that this guy doesn't have any friends and is just completely self-employed and is sort of miserable and sort of drinking all the time. Before you mess with that, okay, and it's tempting to mess with it, absolutely, but before you mess with that, be sure that you're not messing with some part of it that people aren't really interested in somehow, right? Okay, if you're going to sort of write a horror novel and sort of think that sort of like, well, it doesn't have to have, either it doesn't have to have that much gore or else, okay, there should be more gore in it. Understand that, like, there's a segment of your audience that might be kind of enjoying something that you're sort of chopping off with. And yeah, so this is the thing that you need to be careful, except, and then this is the reason why I can't quite come down as this as being advice exactly, is that I feel like, all right, you should know what you're getting into, right? Okay, and especially if you're doing any kind of like self-publishing, there's a reason that like writing really aggressively and specifically to market, although it's always been a thing and it's always something that has happened, but it's taken kind of weird permutations in terms of self-publishing, because what self-publishing has done is that it's taken hordes and hordes of people who otherwise were sitting in the bar at conventions or in the kind of writers' gatherings or wherever you get a bunch of people together like this, that were sort of sitting around and complaining where their publisher always wanted them to do these specific things, and like their publisher didn't really have the guts to let them go take chances. And suddenly, when it's their money being spent on promoting the book, or, you know, these people, suddenly, you know, we get back around to people writing to market even a lot more aggressively than publishers ever were, because again, if it's just you and this is the $2,000 that you have to go put your book out and it's the only $2,000 you really have, then you're not maybe prepared to take some of the same risks that a big publisher is prepared to take. Except, maybe you should, though. I mean, like, isn't that at least a little bit of, like, I guess what a lot of this boils down to is if you're willing to lose, all right? If you feel like, doing something where it's like, okay, I think it should be like this. I think there should be stories like this that exist in the world. I don't know if it's going to be successful or not. I'm rolling the dice. I'm going to write the thing, and then I'm going to go see if there's a market for it. If you do that, there's a very, very good chance of that there's not going to be a market for it. And when I say there's not going to be a market for it, I don't mean that nobody's not going to like it. It's that there's going to be, because what you really need is not just like some of the people that like this genre like the story. Okay, I definitely got that far with the Orphan Fleet books for sure. But what you need is you need enough of a critical mass where it's like not only does the person like the story, but the 5 people that also like that genre broadly that they recommend it to also like it. And that's how you get word of mouth, and that's how you sort of have things spreading. And if you're missing a few of the things from the concept domain of whatever genre that you're doing, then it loses, then and it's a terrible metaphor to be using right now, but the virus that you have, suddenly it doesn't transmit quite as readily as it would before, and then that gets risky. So again, if you're doing it just for commercial purposes, you should understand that that's a trap that you can fall into, and you got to make absolutely sure that you understand the market, and not just the market as a reflection of you, where it's sort of like, well, if I like this, other people are going to like this too. That works for some people. It definitely doesn't work for everybody, so you want to be careful with that. The flip side of that, though, is if you're just putting something into the world that you feel like, I think that this should exist. I think that this should be there. I don't know if it's going to be successful or not. That is fine, but I said you better really mean it when you say that I don't know if this part is going to be successful or not, all right? If you really feel, and I, personally, I'm kind of at peace with it, all right? I'm totally happy. I mean, I'm not done. I'm not finished. I can write other stuff, you know, and I'm also not done trying to promote the Orphan Fleet stuff, too. I'll be trying other things. But you want to have a certain comfort level with, I think even if you are sort of writing to market, that has a pretty high failure rating too, right? So you better, I think it's an awfully good idea just to decide ahead of time, this is a worthy thing. I think that this should exist. Damn the torpedoes. I'll see what happens. I might fail. This is what I think. I come short of making that advice exactly, because again, it's going to depend on where you're coming from. And it's a little bit on the preachy side for people that are writing the market, which is a really cool, interesting skill too. And I really appreciate people that can, there's people that can do both of these things. There's people that can totally write to market and understand exactly what their audience wants and fit in all the other stuff that they want too. But that's a pretty rare skill. And to get there, you need to kind of be able to pull back and take a bigger picture of it. And yeah, I think that introduces the topic a little bit. That's all I got for right now. I want to hear what people think about this. I would love to talk about this more. Maybe do some other videos about it. Tell me what you think. Links by below. You can take a look at books. You can sign up for my mailing list. Please like, please subscribe, please comment, please talk about this stuff. I want to hear what you think. And thank you so much for listening to me. I appreciate it. Good night.